Bueno, esta propuesta, como ya se ha comentado,
This proposal is in its version 4. The slides haven't changed very much because minor adjustments have been made compared to the previous proposal. Because we're short of time, I'll try to speed up. Basically, a summary of what we seek is that the current policies at LAC only consider IPv4 address transfer in a permanent way. In the community, we have seen the need of what is often called leasing addresses. It is quite true, and I'm the first one who always agreed on the fact that if an ISP receives addresses and they don't need them, the honest thing would be to return these. But we are well aware that this doesn't work. Nobody has that mindset. So as a result of this, we approved permanent transfer. What we seek to achieve through this proposal is to do something equivalent to replace an uncontrolled lease, and that the registry system has information that is as correct as possible. This is the same solution we did when we approved the permanent transfers. So basically is what I commented, what you have on the slide. You all have the slides. These have been published. So if you wish to read the text, this will save time. What I'm doing to enable these temporary transfers are minor adjustments to the current text of the permanent transfers. On the right, in blue, you see are the proposed changes. In the past transfers, we now add temporary and final transfers, and we specify that the temporary transfers can only be done within the region.
That is, for the benefit of the region, we are going to allow those temporary transfers to be within the region, which is not the case of the permanent ones that are within the region and with other regions. In the case of temporary transfers, and this is a debate that we've had in the mailing list, we are going to limit it because we believe that precisely because they are temporary, they are meant to solve temporary things. Or for instance, I'm implementing IPv6, I need just a few addresses until I'm done. We are going to limit the size of those transfers to a /20. This is a debate that took place in the list, and apparently here there's consensus among those that gave their feedback. Apparently this is enough, and it would be the right amount. And just as we have a log of the permanent transfers, we would like LACNIC to keep log of those temporary transfers. And what we request is that, given they are temporary, when we ask who is, we'd like to know when, what's the deadline. Of course, it can be then extended for the period, but we want that information to be made available to anybody who does a public query. I think that something important was said there. Yes, something that I'm saying there, and that maybe the word legitimated may not be the best one, but what we want is those extensions of the initial deadline may be known both by the source and the one who received it, and LACNIC should know that it has been extended because we want the date to be public. So if the transfer is extended, then LACNIC needs to have that deadline. Maybe the word legitimize is not the right one. Maybe we could change in the last call we could make an editorial change, or if it's a completely different story and we need a new version. In the case of temporary transfers, LACNIC, in my view, and these are all the issues that were debated in the list, will be capable, as there is a date for putting an end to the transfer that I said that it is extensible, but LACNIC will take it back to the original data. And the rationale is to avoid fraud, that if a company disappears, another one may take over. So I think it's good for LAC to get that back automatically. And finally, there's a new paragraph that was not there for permanent transfers. In the initial versions, it was mandatory, and we tried to impose LAC to oversee all of this. Now they are only recommendations, and it's important to say it, because when we start talking about this, there was a debate between different companies that did address brokerage and leasing, and they themselves admitted that they asked the people who received them to meet certain requirements, or not to use those addresses for spam or for that sort of thing. So from my point of view, it should be mandatory, but the community says that it cannot be mandatory. So at the end, I left it there, just a recommendation. But I think it's important that even if it's a recommendation, it may appear in a specific paragraph of the policy if it reaches consensus. Another debate, also as a result of the impact assessment, is whether these transfers could be treated with sub-assignments. We never discussed how to treat this temporary transfers. For me, it's perfect if we shorten the operations and we use an existing one. There's no problem. And finally, only in the case of RIPE NCC do they accept they admit temporary transfers. And although leasing is not allowed, it's not explicitly banned. So this is the only region where that's happening. In the case of APNIC and AFRINIC, neither leasing nor temporary transfers are accepted. In the case of ARIN, the temporary transfers are not contemplated, but leasing is not a valid justification. But in a way, people know that addresses are leased. And when you do that, you can't request any more. So they put some restrictions. And in addition, certain blocks of IPv4 addresses cannot be leased. And finally, and I think that this is the last slide, if I'm not wrong, the debate in the list, and in my view, the conclusions that we could draw, is the size of the assignment. I think that there shouldn't be any debates. I think that there are no objections. Compliance obligations, I have recommended, we have changed it to make them recommendations so nobody can object. That they should be sub-assignments. It's always been the operative decision, and we don't want to change that. But the important thing here is to be able to identify that it's a temporary transfer in whois and not a final one, because assignments are not always possible. They are possible in the case when you are allocating addresses to the ISPs, but not in the case of end users. However, leasing will be possible in the case of addresses assigned to end users. So it's important to tell that apart, and even if the operative is the same, we should have one or more fields that when establishing the deadline of that period, and to say it public. So date, when and potential extension. And in my view, I think that others agree that it is important, given that these are temporary transfers, there should be a final date. It can be postponed, but my question here is, what's the harm? What would be the problem if we put a deadline? It's because so that would be my rationale here. Those of you who don't want the temporary date to be published, well, maybe you should say it. But I think that this objection is absolutely refuted. And finally, who updates the information in the impact analysis? Then it's the parties that need to update it, and even to prevent frauds. or strange situations where the company that offers the addresses may disappear and somebody else is using it. LACNIC should be able to update the data. And finally, it's not that we debated this in the list, but I think it's too obvious. All the parties must comply with the policies. So it makes sense that those that receive the address need to comply with the policy. Thank you, Jordi. So the impact analysis. So the impact assessment, please, could you show it? First of all, with regard to 232.18.4, we consider that it's not up to LACNIC to say to legitimize the continuation of the contract. We believe that it should be an automatic renewal, and the user should mention the date. With regard to 232.18.7, given that these transfers will be treated as sub-assignments, it's the holder of the resource who must update the information of the block transferred temporarily in the registry's database, and LACNIC does not intervene. We believe that 232.18.8 applies only to the to final transfers. And finally, we interpret that what the author means in the beneficiary is not a valid source for subsequent transfers, they won't be able to transfer those resources. So we recommend. As a result of comment 1, we suggest to alter the text so that it will reflect the comment. With respect to comment 2, we suggest to amend the text so that it may clearly say that it's the holder of resources, not LACNIC, that must do that. And we suggest to adapt the text so that it will reflect what is said in comment 3. In addition, this proposal has an impact on the LACNIC's database and internal systems, and it requires coordination with the NIRs. Thank you, Franco. Jordi's presentation, please. Just a short minute. The last slide, please. Well, basically, I think that throughout the presentation, I answered all the issues of impact assessment. I think that it's up to LACNIC to guarantee that the data is correct, so they have to legitimize, and maybe it's not the best word, but they have to check if there is an extension, and therefore to know that the data are updated, and that if there's an extension, it has to be agreed by the two parties to avoid any frauds. The second, exactly because of the same reason, given that there is a final date that may be extended, so LACNIC is informed about that. LACNIC should be able to update that at the end if there are no further updates. And in 3, I refer to the 2. When I'm not changing anything, it's very clear. And this is why I put it in the other slide, that both parties have to abide by the policies, both sides. It makes sense. And finally, the 4th, LACNIC's interpretation is correct. That would be all. Thank you. All right. So now let's start with the debate, please. You have the Q&A, or you can raise your hand. questions. Your name, please, your organization, and your view, whether you are in favor or against, and say why. 2 minutes to speak and 2 minutes to respond. And if somebody is asking something, try not to repeat it with others. If you see that the answer is the same as the previous one, we'll go to the next one. Here we have Douglas. Douglas Fisher. I'm against the proposal because, well, let me give you the context. I find that leasing is not necessary, but it exists. Everybody knows it exists. And many of the people here in this room do it. And we need to find a way to make it formal, but if you want to do things properly, you can't do it. So I think that the idea of temporary transfers is a sort of euphemism to make it seem as if it were the right thing, but you're not really approaching the problem of leasing. And I don't think that we can use euphemisms. You have to use the right terms about the leasing and not euphemism. I know that it may be painful. I know many people won't agree, but that's their problem. And there's another important issue, and that is that there is a constraint, and it is mandatory as other aspects as RPKI as to the temporary limitations. But I think it should be mandatory, because if we're going to give that block and we're going to use it, I want to make sure that there's a way where the one that receives it, the one that yields it, and IRR may all be sure that it's being used properly. Those the one that's yielding it and the IRR have to identify if there's something wrong. And if there's something fishy, they can remove or take away the resource. I think that that should be mandatory to have the ROA and the RPKI logs. And again, as in the other proposal, I think that, again, it's an issue that requires a lengthy debate.
This was a heated debate in the past, so it was assumed that this should be dealt with in a separate working group so we can reach more consensus and present something that's more mature here in the Public Policy Forum. Douglas, as you are aware, my personal vision is more restriction. I have recognized what the community has expressed. This is no euphemism. This is, when I started working on this topic, I saw that this was equivalent to what we did with the final transfers. That is why I have included this wording to include it in the same section of the manual. But I'm not saying it like this so that this is a euphemism. If leasing would be a euphemism, I wouldn't use that term. I'm against leasing personally. I was against transfers personally. But we have to recognize that this is a reality. We have to adjust the policy to a reality. We also have to understand that the region is at equal level as other regions. If this can be done in other regions, we should also do so. Otherwise, we are preventing better economic development in the region. And I personally insist that I'm against this, but trying to seek the proper definition for the majority. It's not a majority, it's a community. Fernando? All right, let us start analyzing the heading of this proposal, temporary transfers. If it is a temporary transfer, it has to have a term. It has to comply with the proposal. What would be that proposal? What are we intending to do this? This is not an objective. This is just a sort of disguising the lease of a IP address. So there has to be a given validity period. This could be renewed, but there has to be a validity period so that you have the option of renewing this or returning it to the point of origin. That's the first thing. We have to call the things by their name. The second point that led to discussions in the list has to do with the maximum size to do this temporary transfer. Jordi mentioned that it was a /20, if I'm not mistaken, but I think that there should be a /22. Because what is the purpose of allowing these temporary transfers? Some say that this is for the smaller IPs to be active in the internet, the smaller enterprises. But if we allow this to a given size, they will be ending up having a turnover that will allow them to do the correct thing, which is namely to have a permanent transfer, to have cash flow, and to manage the financial resources so that they can have a permanent transfer. So, in my opinion, there should be a limit to this. A /22 should be enough. You can do quite a lot of things with a /22 for a new company, and if the goal is to this enterprise to progress, that is quite a lot. And then further on, they could do a final transfer. To close, people might say that some company prefer to lease because of their cash flow and so on. But as a community, we cannot solve the economic problems that enterprises have with their cash flow. So the way things are right now, I am against this proposal. I would like to ask the audio team, that microphone is much higher than all the others. I can barely hear. I don't know whether the same thing happens to you. Can you please decrease the volume of that microphone, please? Norberto Farias. I don't agree with this policy, but I do agree that there has to be a change. What is the reason? We agree first that there is an issue with leasing, but we're not in charge of using the services with responsibility. We have to make use of these resources, as these resources are coming from other regions to sustain the need of other ISPs. So why should we allow that economic part of the region exit the region if we can have that lease in the region? That's the first point. Secondly, I disagree with temporary transfers, because you should have, as you have in RIPE, there should be a sub-assignment of the resource. The resource was assigned with the ASIN in this profile. This guarantees that the third party won't touch these resources because they are under control of the owner. And I also disagree with the timing. LACNIC won't be able to assess certain variables. If those who lease resources and have a contract and they don't comply with one of the clauses, LACNIC will be unable to change the date because they are not aware of the internal context between the lessee and those who provided the IP. I think this policy should be changed and addressed for a better type of use. Thank you. I think I have clarified everything. Ivan. Good afternoon. Ivan Morales from Guatemala. I agree in principle with temporary transfers. What I don't agree with is in the administrative burden that this will evolve, because LACNIC has to control the timing, it has to control whether there is an extension or not. So we are taking away the responsibility from the entity that already receives the IPs. On the other hand, if we speak about the fact that the person or the entity that is going to receive the temporary assignment also has to comply with LACNIC's processes, this would imply that they would have to receive IPs from LACNIC with a justification, with a diagram, and that would make things quite complicated. I think this is not meaningful if it's going to be temporary. But I think it is quite right that if you have an organization that has quite a lot of IPs available and wishes to release these temporarily, as has been mentioned, they could be sub-assigned, but the responsibility should still be there. So if there's an abuse with the IPs, then that entity has to respond for what happens. And they have the responsibility of bringing about the changes in that sub-assignment. I'd like to say that when we started speaking about this proposal, what the community asked is for LACNIC to assess this. That is why this documentation that you consider as not necessary had to be requested. And this also had to do with one of the types of transfers. I understand your lack of conformity, but the will of the community has been to have this justified. David Mamahon, I'm in favor of the proposal, but some points are not very clear. When there is a temporary transfer, the applicant might request once again a further transfer for the total size of the requested segment. And the second thing I disagree is with the timing, with the entity that is sub-assigning the resources. It should be responsible for its resources and not LACNIC. And then the issue of the recommendations for using these. Who checks that? Who verifies that? Or are these conditions that are simply recommendations? Thank you. I will start with the last one. When we had this discussion with the brokers, they told us that normally they include these conditions in the contracts. In previous versions, we asked LACNIC to verify this. In this version, we decided, because this was one of the major objections of the community, that LACNIC should not be responsible for the verification. That is why we insist that both sides have to comply with the policies. So these are additional conditions to those of the policies. It will be a decision of those who received the resources originally from LACNIC to verify this or not, or to include it in the contract or not. We don't go into that aspect because so far the community didn't wish to have that confirmation. Previously we heard that Douglas, like myself personally, would be in favor of including these as requirements, but the community said that would not be the case. And the second point, could you repeat that? Or the first one, can you repeat that? The issue of the validity periods. We're not saying that LACNIC should establish the periods, the timing. Maybe the word I use might lead to confusion. We're saying that LACNIC is aware of the dates. LACNIC should be aware of the status of the contract, but LACNIC should not set the dates. This information the registry should know this information. And the first question was, I'm sorry? If with an active request that has been assigned, could you file another one? Yes, I remember now. The maximum that can be received is a /20. You cannot receive a /20 from here or a /20 from another. This is an overall amount, /20. Thank you. Ricardo. As we heard already in other forums, I understand this need. I understand the rationale behind this concept. Now, unfortunately, I disagree with what has been presented. I have several concerns. Allow me to mention some of these. The author mentions that there should be clauses that have to do with revoking this in the case of abuse, but he does not specify where these clauses are. I imagine that the author thinks that these clauses are included in a contract between the two parties. Who's going to validate that? If we see that there is no transfer and LACNIC is then involved in things that go beyond their scope and responsibilities, and then the possibility of returning this in case of abuse. Who is going to define the abuse? Who is going to assess the abuse? and the severity that might lead to revoking. And this might be even questioned afterwards and might have a legal impact for LACNIC. The author mentions that recommendations should be included. Of course, all recommendations are valid and important, but where are you going to include these? Once again, I assume this will be in the contract. So there has to be someone who then validates whether these recommendations have been included or not, and this is an unnecessary burden. 30 seconds. I have a question. I wonder whether the author considered this. What would happen if the main lease that is done by LACNIC or the NIR is revoked, and within this allocation there is a temporary transfer? What would occur with that temporary transfer? Well, I didn't quite understand the last part, Ricardo. I will answer the first part very rapidly. I'm going to reformulate my question. Let us imagine that you have an allocation. The holder of this assignment does a temporary transfer, so the holder loses that assignment. That might occur due to lack of payment or whatever. So what would occur then with this block that was under a temporary transfer if the main distribution was revoked? So if these resources are revoked, we understand this is an arduous process. It will take at least 3 months. You always have options prior to revoking this, and this is in section 7 of the policy manual. I think many options will be given prior to revoking this. So LACNIC could, it's just a suggestion, could inform, and this is why it needs to have the information on the temporary nature of these leases or temporary transfers. So it could inform of the risk this poses when leasing to that company, the risk of revoking. Maybe this could report it, maybe not. There might be legal implications, but I'm not aware of this. But we should figure out a solution for this. But this would occur in whatever way we do that leasing. So it's not something explicit of this proposal. It's linked to any form of lease. And the other point you mentioned, I don't know, or might have mistaken with something, or maybe you didn't read something of version 4, but precisely what you gave as an example, in the case of abuse, all that was included in recommendations, and then this prevented from deciding whether LACNIC should check whether that was included in the contract.
So that would be solved. Hernan, yes, Hernan Arcidiacono. It's clear that we went from banning leasing to talking about leasing. And I think that the community has evolved to understand that there's a reality that whether we like it or not, things are happening. And your flexibility, Jody, when talking of the temporary transfers, I think it was very good. I think that all along the different versions, we added things. I think in this version, there's only one thing that is not so convincing. Well, it's two, but they're combined. One is the date of the end. I think that it's not a good thing. And if some say, well, that indicates the temporarity. I don't agree, because the contracts have an end date, and sometimes they are renewed on a monthly or a yearly basis or automatically, and if you don't tell the counterpart. So I think it would be impossible to manage that. And that leads me to the second thing. I don't think it should be LACNIC responsible for making changes, but I think it should be the person responsible for that. So what I don't like about this is that. The rest of the things, I think that you did a good job listening to the community, and things were gradually changed. But honestly, I don't think that the date is an issue that can be handled Thank you for your comments. I understand what you say about temporality. I think that can be automated. The text of the proposal is not saying how that information needs to be given. We might have to change the text to make it more explicit, maybe. But I'm not saying that we cannot have any automatic renewals, or that you would assume it because in the contract it says that it will be renewed every 30 days unless otherwise. Said maybe what you're saying is that LACNIC, or what we could change in a potential new version, if we want to take into consideration what you're saying, is that it could behave as in the case of the sub-assignments, as if the source changes it, unless for force majeure. We could find a way to take the two things into account. It's I think that we could find a solution. So now let's give a priority to LACNIC staff. Well, Alfredo, I'm the service manager at LACNIC. I want to clarify what Ricardo was saying, and Jody made an attempt to answer. Actually, if somebody has a block assigned by LACNIC and transfer temporarily a part of that block, and the big block, for instance, is revoked, then there's no more contract with LACNIC, and that block is revoked, including all the temporary transfers. The same as today with the sub-assignments, but that's the way you would deal with it. Thank you, Alfredo. Hernan. Hernan Seoane Cavase. My view is similar to the rest of the community. This is happening. This needs to be whitewashed, where we have to be open about this, and I think that we are moving forward in this policy. Now, what I don't agree with either is in making the process more complex, because in my view today it already exists, and it's the sub-assignments. Let me say it otherwise. Do we have sub-assignments today? Yes. Do I have to report the deadline? No. Do we have a limit, a /20? No. So there are things that, and I'm saying it as if it were a transfer, but I would do it more as in a sub-assignment. That's something that already exists and it's straightforward, and I would leave the rest for things among the private stakeholders. So if you say, well, I need to know about the date if the company goes out of business, well, and if the company goes out of business, the one who is sub-assigning it, they're the first ones that will find it out, because they have a commercial relation. So they have to see how I can solve it or release it somewhere else. So that part I would leave it up to the private. So I would, and I say I love to discuss this, and I think it's a wonderful progress, but I'd like to check the sub-assignment, and with the existing things, how can we see the leasing? How can we do the leasing? Well, the problem is, and I said it earlier, I have to insist here because it's absolutely important. The problem is that we started this debate in the community. The voice we heard then, even through a debate, I don't remember when it happened, but it was like 2 years ago. Somebody said that the community wanted to have a previous justification. If we don't do it as assignments, we have no such thing. And that is why this was taken to the side of transfers. Now, if the community now thinks otherwise and they want them just to be sub-assignments and the Wild West, I don't care. I try to follow what I hear from the community. I don't know whether your opinion is the majority in the community, but somehow it takes us one way or the other to reach consensus. Thank you. Let's give a priority to the questions in the chat, Franco, and then Freddy. You already took the floor. We have a comment by Oscar Robles. Do you say that there should be a limit date to meet the temporary requirement of a transfer? While I understood that it could be extended, if you request a simple thing, we would just be creating a bureaucratic thing, because those that want to continue it indefinitely would be able to do it. Well, we want the community to be able to know at all times when those transfers are valid. So we are not limiting the transfers. We are not saying that they should be longer than this or that. In the first one, the community told us not to limit the time, because sometimes you can plan that you need it for 6 months, and then finally your transition process to IPv6, the reason why you need it more, will take you 2 years instead of 6 months. That's why I wouldn't put a deadline, but I think that the information is necessary. Fernando, yes, I wanted to make an additional comment, especially for the people who claim the red tape in this process. And, well, I think that it is absolutely normal and necessary. We cannot forget the concept that anything attributed to any block assigned to an organization must be justified. If it was given to the holder initially and it's being sub-assigned to another, that regularly that needs to be justified. If not, if we open our justification, believing that it is just bureaucracy, well, we are marketing with an asset that doesn't belong to us. So actually, finally, the person who can pay more will be getting it instead of those that really need it. So we need some red tape, so to ensure that it is fair, and any block that is attributed to any organization must have a valid justification, and that was analyzed in a neutral way, so that everybody will follow the same rules. So that's because that is democracy. So so I wouldn't eliminate that the possibility. Thank you, Fernando. Ricardo? Yes, very quickly. As to my last question, I want to thank the comments. Alfredo, I know that when you are removing sub-assignments, you're provoking it, because the text as it is does not say clearly that that can happen. As Jordi said, in those cases, it may happen as in the cases that already happen and follow no rules. Having a text that says that there is a temporary transfer, that there are criteria, that there are dates in that assignment, then the idea may be understood that that will not happen. That is, that the temporary transfer should also be eliminated. So I'm saying this just to say that the text does not state it very clearly. Well, and if we clarify this in the text, then maybe, I don't know, I have no problems clarifying it, but we have to clarify it in other parts of the manual. I think that's something that you assume. If the one that's yielding you the resources that disappear, you're the first one to find that out, because the company disappears. So I don't think it's necessary. I have no problems adding that in this text, but we should do it in the sub-assignments too. Thank you, Jordi. Thank you all for participating. A round of applause, please. So now let's measure the temperature to see whether there's consensus. In Zoom, we have a feature that says ballot or voting. Well, please start the poll in Zoom, and we'll ask the staff whether they can help us with the counting. Are you ready to count? Those in favor of the proposal, could you raise your hands? Keep it up. Just a few seconds. Okay. Those of you against this, could you raise your hands and leave them up just a few seconds? Good. Abstentions, raise your hands. The proposal LAC 2023-7 version 4 temporary transfers was debated on May 14th, 2025. So from then on and up to within 2 weeks, we will tell the community whether consensus was reached or not. We invite you to continue to participate in the policy mailing list.